So everyone, it is right at 1:30, so out of respect for your time, we will go ahead and get started. And I am just going to type in the chat real quick that I am talking, so that if anyone can't hear me, they'll know. All right.
Hello.
So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's a very small group that we have. A couple of things. When it was put into Appointment Manager, it said till 3:15, and that's incorrect. You would be here at the latest till 3. And because we're such a small group, it might not take till. So we will just go from this point, and if you have questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, because again, there's so few of us, I don't see any reason to be particularly formal.
If I may interrupt just a second, I'm going to have to leave about 2:30. I've got a doctor's appointment.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
Just so you know, the Zoom automatically does that participant report, so that will show, but it doesn't offend me at all. And thank you for letting me know that I just haven't bored you to death that you ran away.
Okay.
I appreciate that. So my name is Tiffany Hafer, and I work in the Center for Teaching Excellence, specifically assigned to distance learning, but after Cindy Rogers retired, the model's changing a little bit over there, so we are here to help you almost in any way that we possibly can. So always feel free to reach out to us. And just so you know, I know learning objectives can be a super boring, super divisive topic, and so I get that. And in fact, Ray had wanted us to kind of tweak these a little bit for the AMST folks. And if anybody is in here and it's not your college week, that is perfectly fine. Just the one activity that we do is pretty generic, but one of the polls is a little more geared towards the college, but it's certainly, you can get theory from this particular meeting. So, you know, please stay. If somebody needed to come this week instead of their week, that's great, because we were already kind of a puny little group. So I'm happy to have everybody here. So originally I had named this Aligning Content and Learning Objectives. Why does it matter? Because I know a lot of people are like, why does this matter? It really doesn't. And then of course, they wanted it to be a little more fancy, and so I changed it. But then Ray was like, you know, a lot of times learning objectives don't seem that important. How many ways can you do this or that? So for you guys, I changed it back. So having said that, just so you know, I will send you all of this. And this helpful tips, again, really does not apply to you guys because there's so few of you. I don't care if you're muted or not. I mean, if your dog goes ballistic because the mailman came, maybe mute yourself. But even then, most of us have dogs or kids or something. So don't worry too much about that. The file of resources are available in this link, which I can put in the chat, but I also will email you everything. I'll email you the link, but I'll also just download everything and send it to you in the email so that you don't have to download it, because sometimes Google Docs can be kind of a grouchy thing. But we will go ahead and get started. On the off chance we get Zoom bombed, knock on wood, I didn't get Zoom bombed last time. If that does happen, just try to remember to turn off your video and mute your microphone. And we're not doing the breakout room because there's so few of us, so you don't need to worry about that. And I'll just, if I can get the person out, I will. If I can't, then we'll probably have to bail, but we'll talk about that if it happens. Otherwise, we're just going to say it's not. So here's my little evil raccoon, and we're going to get started. So this can be a fairly dry subject. I will try to keep it interesting, and please do ask questions. But instructional alignment is more than just meeting that QM standard that everybody seems to be in love with these days. It's about content, activities, and assessments coming together to make sense to the student and to guide your course. So it's, you know, assessments themselves are way more than just drilling and testing so that you can assign a grade. all of this should be part of a system that provides feedback to the student for their learning path. And we're going to consider Bloom's taxonomy, but we're going to use the revised version, which is a little easier and a little shorter. I also talk very fast. If I go too fast or my accent gets too heavy, you tell me, and I'll try not to drink any more Diet Coke. But anyway, we are going to use that taxonomy to improve the learning system through aligning the objectives, the activities, and the assessments to one another. So in order to do this, we first have to have good learning objectives. And, you know, a lot of people look down their nose at taking learning objectives from the book, but often they're very, very good. So I never say write off the learning objectives that somebody's already done the hard work for you. If it's there and it makes sense and it works, you're more than happy to keep it. But what we need to be able to do is either write or recognize an observable learning objective and one that supports, is supported by the content, and the assessments accurately assess what was the content or the concept, because sometimes it's even more about just a concept that we're taught. But what that ultimately leads us to is that everything is aligned back to that learning objective. And when all that happens, that's what we're looking for as alignment. So I am going to launch a poll, and it is anonymous, so you can be totally honest. If you want to pick the one that says you think learning objectives are pointless, you feel free. So we'll just leave it up for a little bit because there's not many of us. I'll wait till most people have answered it, and then I'm going to take a screenshot of just that, not your faces, and we'll go from there. And this is really just kind of lets me know where you are at the moment, what you think about it, and how you feel. And the fact that you're here probably means that you don't hate them, so because you had other choices, and so for that I appreciate it. I think that's just about everything. Oops. Sometimes when I do that, I screw up the share. Can y'all still see the screen? Perfect. All right. All right, so almost everybody said the same thing, so that's great. And thank you for that. And I hope you meant it. So I appreciate that you see some value in them. But we're just going to go back to now talking about what the objective really does, and that is the expectation for the student performance. So if the objectives are an expectation of that student performance, then we need to be able to verbalize what we want that student to do, or be able to do when they finish the course. So maybe we just need them to know something, but maybe we need them to be able to do something. You know, they need to be able to drive a truck, or they need to be able to walk into some type of plant or manufacturing environment and not cut off a finger. You know, it can be very specific, or it can be very related to the particular course that you're at in the pathway. So if they're in ways that clearly state what they're going to do or what they're going to learn, and it's written in their voice, then we've set the stage for their success. Good objectives can be referred back to all through your course, all through activities and assessments, to show them how it supports them and what they're doing. Because, I mean, we always hear, this is going to be on the test, you didn't teach us what you tested us on. You know, there's always a variety of complaints, or when am I ever going to use this? So if we can tie it back to the rest of the course in that way, it shows the learning path. And as you know, we're very much into trying to incorporate guided pathways, not just through programs, but college-wide, and to bring some semblance of that path visually to the student in each course. So, you know, as this happens, they can become more aware of their own learning, and hopefully they will, you know, they'll get some ability to control, monitor, and regulate that learning, which leads us back to the metacognitive piece that you probably were at with Mary Helen earlier. So the activities, that can be content, that can be reading, but that can also be things that they do formatively to prepare them for the assessments, for the more high stakes type things. So those activities, they need to engage them and help them achieve the intended learning objectives. So it's taking us back to the objective again. And as I was saying earlier, you know, because they will whine and complain a lot of times that we don't test them, or, you know, in ways that we prepared them or they didn't know. And so if the activity clearly models that objective goal, that inspires their confidence in you and in the whole process, because it helps them engage, because they'll hopefully learn pretty early in your course. And I know a lot of times, especially with AMST, they're going to see the same people over and over again. So it's going to help them know that you just don't come at this in a way that's punitive or difficult. That while your course might be difficult, they know what they need to do because you keep telling them. And so that helps them to be more successful on those high stakes bits that we're going to talk about now. So we all know assessment's the grade, you know, it's the big all important grade, but as I've said earlier, you know, it's more than just that. It is a system. It should be a process for collecting supporting evidence about what they learned or what they can do. So on your end, it's going to involve observing, recording, scoring, all that stuff you always do, but then interpreting it in a way that makes sense. And if you've got a good system in place where you've been providing feedback and you made it very clear from the beginning what they were supposed to do, it doesn't just help them, but it helps you, because it provides all the evidence and support that you could ever need to support the grade that you gave. You know, so beyond that solid argument that, you know, you did see work, you can say, look, you had to do it this way. We talked about you were going to learn to do X, Y, and Z, and you only learned X and Y. So that's why you didn't get an A. And so their chances of success are going to be vastly improved if we give them relative content that builds on those formative activities. And then you measure exactly what you said you would and what you taught. So a lot of people, again, just don't think it's all that important, but it does keep us moving in the right direction. So when learning activities relate directly to the objectives and the assessments accurately measure all of that, it's a lot easier to hit targets, not just for them, for you. You know, people that stick it out in the program and get their credential, or students that do well, and then it helps the student do well and it helps keep them engaged and happy and moving forward. But if they're not in alignment, then sometimes we get a kind of fragmented, directionless course, and the student might feel that they're getting mixed messages about what they need to learn or how they need to show it. And students might spend activities on stuff that's just not as helpful for the long term or the end game that you want to get to. And then for you, you might overestimate or underestimate the effectiveness of a certain type of instruction. And I know a lot of you have been teaching your thing, or you worked in it for years. So I understand that. Just sometimes, you know, because even though learning objectives, quote unquote, are enduring, they're sitting there, they're in your course, and they're looking at the student in the face, doesn't mean you can't tweak them. Like if you're going along and you're like, oh, you know, I thought that was a great LO, but it's not. You know, you can adjust. You have so much instructor choice working in higher ed that maybe you wouldn't have, say, in K-12, where standards are pretty hard and fast. So this allows you a lot of flexibility as well. And while I hope that kind of impressed upon you that alignment really is important, the next big thing is how do we do it? Because a lot of times things sound real easy, or they sound real good on paper, and then it's harder to do, or does it make sense once you kind of get into it. So So again, back to the taxonomy that I'll bring up in a little bit, we're going to use that to not only classify the objectives, but to kind of map out your activities and your assessments. And we're not going to do all that today. I mean, it's something you're going to get to take away, work on, and then at those second and third meetings that you'll be having within your colleges, you'll have a chance to work with like-minded folk and see what works or what kind of ideas your colleagues can bring to the table. So, you know, there's more than one taxonomy out there. Bloom's is probably the best known. And we're not going to go into a big, long history of Bloom's and why it's good or bad. Just keep in mind that, you know, think of it as a classification system like you would for anything. It's a way of thinking and learning, and it moves from the most simple to the most complex, and or if you want to think about it this way, from the concrete to the more abstract way of thinking. And so this is a quick recap of the revised Bloom's. Again, I mentioned we would use revised because the old Bloom's, you know, it's kind of big and cumbersome. So we're going from the simple to the complex and the concrete to the abstract. But you know, obviously there's stages. I mean, they need to remember stuff before they can generally understand it. And then, you know, once we've got them kind of understanding it, we want them to apply it, then they might analyze it. And, you know, eventually at some point they're going to create something brand new from themselves. But it's a little bit different from the original Bloom's. And I lied, I'm going to drink some more Diet Coke because I'm getting all froggy sounded on you. But I just think this is a little more useful for you for planning your curriculum, your instruction, and your assessment. So we're just going to kind of zip through some stuff about learning objectives. You know, every program out there, anywhere, not just at Tech, but begins with a goal, and that can be broken down into the specific goal, which is what I mean by learning objectives. So when they're concise statements about what the student needs to do, then they can complete that. You can complete the instruction and they can be successful at it. And well-defined, articulated learning objectives are important because they do give that clear purpose. And I know I repeat that a lot. It's just super important to kind of remember that the student really, to be successful, needs to understand. So a learning goal versus a learning objective, people get confused on that. I don't really care so much about the semantics, as long as you know that the goal is kind of your big overarching desire. When they come out of that class, they can, and y'all are going to laugh at me because I'm going to make up something and it's not going to make any sense, but say, well, the 4 points so that they don't fall apart. But the particular objective is going to be a little more brief and clear. It's going to be like student will be able to successfully weld 1 point, you know, or something along those lines. Obviously, I don't know what I'm talking about, but it is. It's kind of, think of it as the piece of a puzzle. Where's the goals, the completed puzzle, the objectives are the pieces in there that fit together. It's important to have a measurable verb in each and every one, and it has to be measurable. That's things like define, identify, defend, you know, things like understand and know. They're important. We need to understand and know, and they're on the taxonomy table, but that's the cognitive order that we want them to understand. But for them, you can't measure understand. The kid can say, I do understand it, I just failed the test. So we want you to pick words that you can actually adequately measure. And then this gets to one verb per objective. And I know that sometimes gets frustrating because then things that you would normally combine, like compare and contrast, we've all done it. We've seen it a million times. It's been done to us. So it helps make it more succinct. But the problem is, if there's two, how are you going to measure the mastery? So if they compare but they didn't contrast, which seems to be what kids always do. They always leave off the contrast part. Did they get it? Did they not get it? Do they get a portion? Do you have a good rubric? You know, because then it makes it harder on you because you've got to then work harder at the whole assessment piece. So it's better if you could split it out into two. I know it gets long sometimes. And then you want to ensure that the verb in the course level ones versus the, say, module or the unit or the lesson or however you break yours out are at least at the highest blooms in a lesson. So in other words, they need to be equal at height. Don't have something in a lesson that is higher than your course, because that doesn't make sense. Because the course is the ultimate goal. So just kind of keep that in mind. And somebody can always help you with that. That's not a big deal. And then strive to keep all of them measurable, clear, and concise, which is basically what we've been talking about. Because again, that learn and understand is, it's, you know, it's a really great high thinking goal, but we can't measure it adequately. And we're not going to break out. I changed it to an activity because, and you don't need to see that. I'm going to share, I'm going to shrink the PowerPoint and bring up this. So can you see my Google Sheet? Yeah. So normally, if it was a bigger group, there's a bunch of groups down here at the bottom. And there's actually enough that everybody could do their own, but I didn't really see the point in that. But I would like you guys, maybe, I'm going to unmute you if you don't mind. And you don't have to, some of you are going to have to unmute yourselves. You don't have to if you really don't want to. But we'll go through quicker, I think, if we do. So normally I would have sent you out in the groups, and I did the first one for you because that's obviously the easy one. That's the way the breakouts always work, right? But what we've got is a before learning objective, and just want to discuss what maybe the problem was, and then maybe try to rewrite it. And then there's nothing in me. That was just me saying it was your example. I am going to pull my other little note over here so you don't have to look at my resources. So we did so obviously understand immigration policy. Problem after what we've been talking about was that understands not measurable. So a better one might be describe the history of American immigration policy. That's really pretty broad if you want to get right down to it. But you know, but that is a better one, and that's all we're going for right now. So anybody wants to hop in and say anything, what do you think might be the problem with describe and create a marketing plan?
Got two verbs there.
Exactly. So, and normally I'll have y'all type in here, but I didn't see the point in making you guys have to go out to the sheet and all that. So how would you fix it? Would you just break it into two, or what you think?
Well, I'd have to ask myself the question, can I create it without being able to describe it? And really? If I can, then maybe I need to make two separate ones. But if I can't, then just say, you know, create one.
Right. Perfect. Because, you know, maybe early on they've got an activity, you know, this is an LO, so we would maybe break it out into two where they would describe a marketing plan of another organization and then create one for their own. But that's perfect.
So you said LO, you're talking about learning objective, right?
Yes, I'm so sorry.
Fine. Just trying to catch up with the jargon.
No, sorry. I try not to do that, and then
That's
I get lazy.
as long as we know.
You could describe the need for a marketing plan.
Yeah, so if, you know, depending on like what was going on in the chapter, because if they can't understand the needs analysis, you're right. So there's a lot that could be done with that one. So so that's really good. Now, become familiar with the elements of editing.
The become familiar is not measurable.
That's exactly right. I mean, sure, they can do it, but how do you measure that they did it? And they'll be like, yeah, I went out and read some stuff, you know, but I can't explain anything to you. Just for, we agreed that it would probably need to be more than that. What would you maybe want to write instead? And realize, I understand you really don't know the content. These are,
You could list.
yep. So they could identify, list, and then you might include, you know, 3 or 4, because they might do more involved ones later. You know, it all depends on where you are in your content. So absolutely. What's wrong with complete the assignment?
That's always the objective, isn't it?
It's more of a
Yeah,
pass-fail
perfect.
sort of thing.
He said that it's not a learning objective at all. I mean, it's really what we want them to do in the end, but it's more of a goal or an outcome. They're going to complete something. So we would say, you know, I'm not going to type LO, I'm going to type learning objective. So, you know, depending on what that assignment might be, they would need to create an infographic on, and I don't know what subject, but, you know, suppose we wanted them to, it was a graphic arts class, maybe they got to pick their subject, but we wanted them to do an infographic and it had to be by rules of thirds. And so there would be a lot of things that they could do there. So whatever that assignment is, we would need to have an objective related
Now,
to that.
this also, you know, I think you said earlier that these ought to be kept short and sweet, but really the student also ought to know to what degree he's going to have to do things. For example, complete the assignment with less than 3 errors, or, you know, something like that. But that would have to be, you know, laid out on a rubric, but it could be included in the objective. And some would say stuff like that needs to be in an objective.
And I think that you have flexibility there. I'm not going to sit here and tell you, I think it needs to be in the rubric and nowhere else, because I get what you are saying. So, like, for instance, my pre-made one for editing was I had identify elements of editing, including composition, setting, and lighting. So, you know, identify is probably not the best there because they need to identify them, but we also want them to describe probably. So there's one where you could put some more information in learning objective. If you want the learning objective to include certain success criteria, I'm not going to tell you no. We will talk about assessments and like when a rubric might be helpful versus a checklist, but we're not going to do a huge deep dive into that either. So, but that's also a place where we could put that, you know, because oftentimes you will see the rubrics where they're like, grammar is not, you know, not so many errors that it's distracting or something like that, and then they'll define that as less than 5 or something along those lines. So, so to this 4th one, I mean, it's technically 5th, but I think this one's tricky because I technically think it's a pretty good learning objective, and I apologize if my hair goes weird, guys. COVID's been hard on those of us that have to, are supposed to get a cut. I'm lazy about that. So is there really a problem? And if there is it really kind of a hoity-toity, that's not really a problem? And you can say it, there's no problem if you really believe that, and I'm fine with that, and I will buy that. But I'll also tell you what some other people might say.
To me, the word various in there just isn't clear enough.
Yeah, that's really good, and that's actually not what I had, but you're right. So various is the vague. I mean, what does that mean? Are we going to do 3? We're going to do 20? Because you know, if kid then gets into that module and it's like just goes on for days, they're going to get frustrated maybe. So some people would say that this objective is not student-centered, that it's more what you're going to do. You're going to explain. But I don't buy that. If explain is a perfectly good verb and it's measurable in every other situation, I felt, because I pulled some of these from different people's views, so I don't buy it. I think it's fine. I think it could be maybe tweaked or worded a little better, but I just don't think that explain the benefits is wrong. Could maybe we say they're going to determine the most appropriate exercise modality for a patient over 65? Sure. That might be more in line with content, but we don't have the content in front of us. So that was just kind of a trick one. I don't hate that objective personally. And then the last one, and then we'll go back to some other stuff. Formulate a management for each of the above. And I didn't reference this earlier, but why might this be confusing if you were the student?
Each of the above what?
Yeah. So obviously it was meant to be one in a series of objectives, but they should stand alone. So without referencing other objectives, kind of like what we were saying before, if we break out compare and contrast the effects of European invasion on indigenous peoples, and so if we may compare Spain versus this, in the next one you wouldn't say contrast the above. You know, you would repeat it so the student had a good idea of what you really expected them to do. So, you know, that's exactly it. If it's confusing to me and you, it's definitely going to be confusing to a student. So that's, you know, thank y'all for being very active and participating, because that's actually more fun than sending you guys out to breakout rooms where I know everybody just kind of goes, hey, I haven't seen you in forever. How you doing? Yeah. So thank you very much. So that was just our little activity to kind of help us break down a learning objective and understand when they're good or when they can maybe just be a little bit better. Because, you know, to me, it's not binary. It's not all bad or all good. I mean, sometimes they're terrible, but sometimes they just need a little help. But next we're going to talk about actually plotting your course, which means objectives and assessments and everything on this cognitive process dimension chart. Having said that, it looks overwhelming. We're going to look at a few, and I'm just going to talk to you about it. I don't expect you to walk away today and do this everywhere. What I would like is that maybe you try it out on one, you know, see if you could plot your own course. I know nobody has extra time, but at some point in our lives. So, but you're probably looking at the table and wondering, you know, how would this ever possibly help me? And I've got a copy that you can that I will email you, that you can actually type in and do stuff in. But, yeah, I mentioned that if everything's aligned, then it helps the student learning. So if we can plot it here, then you have a visual idea of how to approach your course a little more systematically and effectively. And some of you may not have any trouble there. You know, it doesn't mean that everybody needs this, but, you know, especially if you're doing a brand new course, I think, you know, when they created the new maths to help with the different pathways, this kind of thing would help maybe keep people on path. You can focus the learning effort on the appropriate objective, and then we can select assessments that help with the student learning. So this whole table, what it does is it reflects Bloom's by categories of or levels of learning, and we're going to go from the more simple to the complex. So it's essentially taking that pyramid from earlier and just stretching it out into a table that you could actually interact with. So, you know, remember is the easiest one of all. It's either recognizing a term, being able to recall something, match it. You know, it's facts and concepts without anything deeper. You said it to me, I said it back to you. The next one is we move to understand. And again, these aren't the verbs that we use in learning objectives. They're that knowledge that we want them to have. So at this point, they remember this stuff, but we want them to be able to kind of construct some kind of meaning from it, whatever that might be. Then if they can do that, then they can probably apply it. They can actually use the idea or the concept to solve the problem. And then, after that, we get into some sort of analysis where maybe they're going to break something down into components. They can see a relationship further out. But there's some kind of overall structure that they can see and that it can break apart. Sorry, my little wheel got excited. And then after that, hopefully they can evaluate something and make some judgments based on all this stuff that they've been remembering, understanding, applying. Now they've got this criteria or this standard, and they can evaluate. A lot of times in healthcare, that might deal with something along the lines of they've done a patient intake and they're going to make some sort of judgment based on that criteria. And then, the highest level one is they're going to create something. They're going to be able to reorganize that information we gave them into some other new form or new pattern when that's appropriate. And that's not always appropriate. I mean, you can't rearrange anatomy or how a wrench works, not saying that. You don't necessarily always hit even 3 of these. It just depends on what it is we're teaching. And then just with all that in the back of your mind, this left side, this lists the types of knowledge within those dimensions. And again, it's back to that concrete to abstract kind of thing. But they don't necessarily range on that complexity scale that I talked about. For example, like a learning procedure or skill, it might not require mastery of all the related facts and concepts before they can do something. So it doesn't necessarily have to be lockstep. And then that whole metacognitive piece at the bottom, that's that knowing how well they know it. And that can be done at any level of learning. But that's where we're making them more self-aware and letting them learn to drive their school bus. So kind of helps to keep in mind the relationship between that knowledge dimension. For instance, factual, you're not going to read all this on the screen, and I'm happy to share these if you want them, and if you don't, won't hurt my feelings. But, that's knowing that, like that is a type of welding point, or that is such and such a piece of machinery. Whereas conceptual is more about classifications and categorizing. That's the what and the why. Like that's an X type of tool, and I use it here. Why? Why would I use this one instead of that one? And then procedural is the actual how. That's like they can show that they can do something. And that's regardless of discipline. That might be solving an algebra problem, but it might be doing some welding. And then the metacognitive is, again, the how to know, which means that they're more aware of their learning. And I know there's been a lot of talk about metacognition lately, and I don't want for you to check out on me because of that. It is really something that we think is going to help with student retention. So, I'm not the knowledge expert on that. That is Mary Helen. But more than happy to get you guys any information you might want on that. So plotting the course on the table, this one looks slightly different because I snagged somebody's little doohickey. And this is just a fun little way to show, like before it kind of just looked like this weird table and you're like, well, I don't understand it. So, if they start to go all over the place, like you've got objectives way up here and activities way down here, they're probably not aligned. And yes, usually this little video screen share thing showed that plotting it on the table meant they lined up in the matrix. And that's what it looks like when they're aligned and when they're not. But we will get into the fact later that they don't necessarily all have to be in one little box to be aligned. Sometimes you need to know how to do stuff down here in order. Like here's an activity. I think I replayed the same one, and I apologize. But we'll talk about. I'll show you some where they're not aligned. But again, I talked about this earlier. Sometimes things just, somebody came up with this great theory and it looks good on paper, and then you get into it and it just doesn't work for you. And I'm not saying that this won't work. I'm saying that it is harder to do in reality. So when we think about where to plot each objective or activity or assessment, that's where you become the teacher. You're the expert, and you have to do that complex cognitive thinking of your own. So you'll generally, you have some objectives and activities and assessments, and they're in the same cell, like I showed you earlier. Well, that's definitely aligned because they're all living on that same little spot. But, maybe they don't always line up exactly in the same cell, and that's okay because, again, like I said, sometimes you have to remember something before you can do the next thing, and we'll talk about those natural progressions that make sense. So in those cases, the objective might push the activity off the cloud, and that's okay. So I don't want everybody to think that everything has to cram into the same cell. When you look at this later on your own, it does not. And it is 2:12, and we've only got 45 more minutes. So I just wanted to give you guys a quick break. I know that there's not a lot of us that hasn't been crazy, and everybody's a grown up, and if y'all had to go to the bathroom, I wasn't. Nobody's going to say anything. But I'd like everybody to maybe take 5 minutes just to go check on, maybe get soda or use the bathroom. It is 2:12, so 2:20. I'll see you back. Sorry about that. As usual, it's just like on NPR when the guy's going, you muted yourself, you muted yourself. Anyway, so that break was just as much for me as for you. So thank you for the quick break. So this is I'm going to show you these relations like I mentioned earlier. So sure, it makes sense that if it's factual, they need to remember it. Conceptual, they need to understand it, and procedural, they need to apply it. It doesn't always work this way exactly down the table, but those are the logical associations and progressions. And so if you're teaching in one of these dimensions that I've got circled, you should always assess its cognitive process. So, other cognitive processes higher up, such as the analyze, evaluate, and create, they're more generalizable, and I always struggle with that word. But so if a student is learning factual knowledge, then you should be able to assess their ability to remember it. And so, if it's concepts, and then assess their understanding, and so forth and so on. And then I've browned out the metacognition down here at the bottom, just as because that's that whole level that's the awareness of thinking and learning. And as important as it is, because and when I say we, I mean us students, people, we use it to learn to solve problems. And that self-knowledge of our mental strengths and weaknesses makes us better students, makes us better educators. And it's where they say we learn best. And so since it's so critical to the learning process, I just want to make sure that it's harder to measure, but I wanted you to know that it really does flow across the process. Like I said earlier, it's not metacognition's off over here in this weird little island all by itself. It doesn't matter if it's factual knowledge. They hopefully at some point will learn to measure their own point in their learning process where how they're doing with that factual type of information. So, to the further end, when we try to incorporate objectives, activities, and assessments for those more complex processes, 4 to 6, these processes facilitate the retention from the other processes. So having a student evaluate a procedure will facilitate their recall and understanding. So factual and remembering all play into it. And this all does lead to a point, which was, you know, where we'll get to maybe everything doesn't fit into the same little square. So to accomplish one objective, you know, we might need activities across all of them. And so that's kind of where I was going earlier with, you know, the objective might kick the activity off of their cloud, because you can plot it and say, I've got activities that require them to understand and apply something, even though the objective is analytical in nature. And that's because they don't necessarily have to line up neatly. This is harder. If you can get them all into one cell and you feel better about it, you know, I say that's a good starting point. You know, and the Center for Teaching Excellence is here to help you look at something and say, no, they don't necessarily have to all be in the same cell, but I don't know if that exactly works. But the reason for that is that, again, you know, they had to make this journey to get to the to be able to analyze. So I always, and I've heard other instructional designers say, oh, they need to rewrite that learning objective because it said to list something, and they have an activity where they're discussing at a slightly higher level on the discussion board in D12. That's not necessarily wrong. So, you know, please know, again, that you know what you're doing for the most part, and we're here to help you with that. But this is a lot of text. I do have it out in the document, so I'm just going to kind of give you an overview, and then you can always look at it more in depth. And I know that this is a writing sample, but it's kind of one that just works really well for what we're talking about. So the goal was for them to, well, the objective was for them to explain the effects of taxes on colonies, basically. And at some point, they're given activities where they research facts and then write a persuasive article. And they have to do it from one point or another. So we would plot this, and we'll see it. It's in the understanding of conceptual knowledge, because they need to understand the effect of the taxes. But the objective is that they're going to explain that effect. So see how it's not all in the same? I mean, here there is a factual activity because they needed to be able to remember it. The objective was that they're understanding it, but they are analyzing some stuff, evaluating it, and they're creating the essay. So this may feel wrong, and I understand that. And if you're uncomfortable with it, you don't have to go there. But they're conceptual, and conceptual can go across the entire way. But the objective initially was for them to understand taxes, and so you're giving them ways of using the higher cognitive processes to facilitate their learning. And then we get into assessments, and this is kind of fun because a lot of times people really hate tests because they always think they've got to write multiple choice question test and come up with really good distractors that aren't too easy. But we're going to find out that, you know, no single type of assessment provides the complete picture. And that's one great thing about a technical school. A lot of stuff like falls into projects and performances, or actually concept maps. People don't really think of them that way, but they do. And so a lot of this is stuff you're already doing. You're already providing variety, and you're not going to have to change much in your life. So, but we're just going to talk about the different kinds that are out there, and, you know, how to tie it in. And so we'll start with tried and the true, and we'll go through what seems like different ones. And again, they want another poll. So, ooh, I never did in that poll. That's crazy. All right. So I'm going to launch you a poll. Now this one is, I tried to write it a little more to stuff that makes sense to you guys. And I'm not going to talk over it because it's a little more wordy than most. everybody was, I think, was in agreement on the other one. So almost everybody picked the first one, which is what I would tend to agree with. But what I like is that y'all really took to heart what I just said, that maybe we're going to assess on a lower cognitive level. In a perfect world, I think application would be them presenting the attire in some way, whatever that is, either through a presentation video, something like that. Multiple choice quiz question might not be applied, but they do have to remember which shoes are correct, so I can see where that one came from. And then the discussion board of activity, they actually at this one, I feel like it's going even higher. I feel like it's going up to create, because they're taking the information, maybe not create, they're analyzing it. They're taking the information again and using it and breaking it down and coming up with something new. So good job, guys. Sorry, I'm going to end the poll because I didn't do that last time, apparently. So that was just us talking about. That was just our opportunity to look at the poll. So this is not to be condescending. I know you guys understand the difference between formative and summative, but just a reminder to all of us, you know, high stakes versus kind of the before things, and you know,
Tiffany, we still see the poll.
Do you? Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me know. Let me go back to polls and see what's wrong with it. Stop share results. You know,
That's actually
I feel like every bad stereotype of a Zoom person sometimes. It's like I'm supposed to be a center for teaching excellence, help you guys, and then I might leave them a poll up. So thank you for sharing. Let me know that. So can you see the screen better now with that going? So formative, you know, that's where all along the students are going to be getting some feedback and understanding, you know, where to focus their efforts if maybe they've gone off track. And then the summative is done more at the conclusion. And I always hate the way that sounds like we just mean the final, because of course it doesn't. I mean, that could be at the end of each module if that's the way it needs to be. You know, if you need to summatively assess that often, I mean, obviously you need to judge and learn and assign grades. So, you know, we all know what that is. So choosing assessments, again, objective tests. That's the tried and true. We all know it. It can be used for formative or summative, and you know, it can have the selected or constructed responses. And some people think it's the quote, the good, bad, and the ugly, and meaning that it's convenient because it's, you know, it's pretty easy to administer, whether that's in class, in the testing center, or through D2L. And you can focus on the very relevant things you need to test, such as if correct spelling is the objective, then, you know, then that's important, and we can test for that. The drawbacks here is it does focus more on the simple cognitive processes like remembering and understanding, and it tends to, oh gracious, sorry guys. It does tend to compartmentalize a little bit, and I apologize, my wheel goes crazy sometimes, or maybe requires them to perform a lot of context, and it can be subjective, because even though the scoring's objective, the test creation is subjective. So, you know, that's all that is. And, you know, the difference between selected response is multiple choice, true, false, and matching type things, whereas constructed is where they're doing the construction. They're giving you something. They're filling in the blank, or it's a short answer or show your work. So, you know, again, it's typically used to assess remembering and understanding. I'm not saying we can't use it in other ways, because if we construct it properly, we can assess some of those higher complex processes, such as applying and analyzing and evaluating, not necessarily creating. But writing test questions that assess those more complex processes requires a lot of time and skill and creativity. And so for those, I just recommend that you incorporate text, quotes, data, tables if you need to, but that's when they might have the opportunity to interpret or draw conclusions, even though it's an objective test. They use that a lot in econ. Like here's a plotted graph chart, and they have to analyze it and somehow interpret something and answer the question properly that way. So just, again, these are more frequent and effective down here in 1 and 2. Doesn't mean we can't use them other places, but it can be. And a tip, if you are using it for procedural, just know that, to assess procedural knowledge, the objective can assess prerequisite knowledge, which is all these areas shown in blue, but doesn't generally do this with pen and paper, but you can if it involves like a mathematical problem, spreadsheets, or maps. So, procedural can still be done this way. It's a little harder, but I didn't want to leave it out. So essays. Now, this, and you'll see where I plot it more in the middle, but this helps more demonstrate their ability to understand, apply, analyze, visualize, and create. But this doesn't have to mean a 5-page, 1-inch margin paper and Arial font. I mean, this can be short paragraphs. It could be an essay question within the previous type, the more objective test. That's the constructed type answer, but we're bringing it up just a little bit of a level here. And so it's a flexible tool. People a lot of times have a preconceived notion about the essay, that it is just what I was saying, like, why would anybody need to write an essay on truck driving or, something like that. But maybe it's an essay question where they're given a scenario and they need to talk about it to you, just like they would maybe in class. And you're not necessarily grading their ability to construct this beautiful sentence. You're going to assess that they know what to do in a specific situation.
Well, sometimes constructing a sentence helps you understand what they're trying to convey, which many times I find my students can't convey their way out of a wet paper bag. So I've gotten away from these essay and short answer questions in many cases, not all, but I found that they were better able to understand what I said than to be able to say what they mean. So those other types of tests, although it's harder to craft them for those higher levels of learning, it's had to be worth the effort, and they've had to be honed over time to make sure that the students understand the questions. But, we have some students that are coming through just taking a certificate program where they need no English class to be able to learn how to write something somebody can understand. So some of these students, like I said, they might know what they mean, but they sure can't say it, convey it.
Sure. No, I know. And so, it sounds like you've really kind of sussed out where that makes sense for you and where it doesn't, or how to make it work. So that might be one of those situations where you, later in the year, and with COVID, everything right now feels like we keep saying later, we're going to do stuff later. We are talking about doing some sort of PD or development on the alternative types of assessments, and whether in that or when you just meet back with your colleges and your deans and talk about what y'all want to do going forward with guided pathways, whatnot. Terry, I think that's a really good, you might have some really good examples that would really help people.
Well, one thing also that I'd add is that some of these higher levels, I actually use them for formatives, not summatives, because, for example, I have them write an essay on what we call the basic vapor compression cycle. Okay. Now, if I had to grade that, it'd be real horrible, and they get a grade just for kind of doing it.
Gotcha.
But it's worth the exercise for them because it helps them bring together in their own mind how these things interact with one another if they give it a good effort. Even though they may not be able to convey it, they've had to think about it in these ways. And so even when I'm giving exercises, we'll call them, that are formative, I have them write answers out. I'll try not to give them any multiple choice on those formatives, but it's on the summatives where I have to go multiple choice because, like I said, it's easier for them to work in that environment.
Sure. No, I think that's a really good point in that formative isn't trash activity. You know, you've done a great job there of saying they need to be able to do these certain things to meet the objective and then to further be successful on the summative, which is the whole point. You know, we want them to be successful.
They got to do the push-ups. And
that's exactly right. So
yeah, sometimes I give them some of these assignments. It'd be like, you know, why do I have to do this? I'm not going to have to do this out in the field. And I'm like, well, you know what? That's like the football player saying to the coach, why do I got to do sit-ups? Well, it's preparing you for the things you have to do. Mm-hmm. You might not like it, but these are exercises. They have a purpose for them, and that's to help you learn and to create your processes working right.
No, I think that's great. I really like that. So I may steal that from you. But, you know, like we were saying, this one's kind of used for these first 5 levels, and it's flexible because we can tailor it, combine it with the objective test, or it can stand alone like you do, where you use it formatively, and then later you're just going to use the more objective tool. But you prepared them through this one. The only thing about this is you have to be clear about how they're going to be graded. Like with your kids, if it's kids, I mean, some of them are 50. If you tell them they got to write this thing and it freaks them out so bad that they don't do it, that's not good. But if you're saying, look, this is about the effort, you know, and you're clear about how you're going to grade them, or so it can be that, it can be a rubric, it could be, you know, simply you didn't have more than 5 errors, or, you know, whatever it is that's important. Just be clear about it. Also, to take care of yourself, you can't underestimate the time you're going to need for grading. Depending on, you know, size of classes and loads and all of that, you know, it can really be overwhelming. I've had so many, when I was in the K-12 environment, Department of Ed, you know, there's that teacher who wants to write the course, and they're the best person because they really understand AP, whatever, but by the same token, they think everybody's got an unlimited amount of time and no life to grade 20 essays, and they do not. So just take care of yourself is really all I'm saying there. And then that feedback is crucial, which sounds like, you know, you've really got to knock on that. They need to understand why it was important, why they got the grade they got, and how they can make it better. And then if you can incorporate it into objective tests. But if it's not appropriate, then don't. And they are most effective, you know, they're effective across the blue, but they're really most effective in that analyze and evaluate and apply. So, but anything in the blue really is good. I highlighted procedural in gray because even though it's oftentimes these are best, procedurals are best done with like some sort of performance, which we'll talk about in a minute. I mean, an essay can demonstrate basic knowledge of the procedure depending on what you've asked them to write about.
You can ask them sometimes, you know, what are steps in this procedure that some people leave them out, and why did they leave them out? You know, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. That is perfect because then, you know, that's an opportunity to make them, you know, think a little deeper too. Like, it's like that old peanut butter sandwich thing, you know, like if you don't take off the lid, how do you get the peanut butter out? You know, so what do people forget to do? So concept maps. You know, I feel like these encourage some deeper understanding. They're not necessarily those bubble maps that we all think about. This could actually be that it's a map that's already done, but they've got to identify or classify or organize. So I don't want everybody to think it's just that weird little, thing that looks like the constellations. I mean, you can use this in a variety of disciplines, but it requires them to be able to sometimes as simple as point to it and identify something. So you can use it in different areas, and it can be formative or summative. And it gives a literal picture of what they know versus what they really don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's true. If they're looking at the lung and they think it's the liver, that might be an issue. So what I like about these is it does allow for individual interpretation when that's appropriate. Again, the liver is never the lung, but we don't all necessarily visualize things the same. So that's why this might be good for, certain groupings of students. It might not be something that you write into every one of your courses, but you realize partway through a semester that, the group you have might do better with this. And so it might just be your backup item. And there are directed versus undirected, and then that mushy somewhere in between. But very directive is what I was talking about earlier, where maybe they're labeling items, or they're labeling the lines, like they're showing the relationship, like here to here means something. Undirected is more what they're constructing, they're creating again. It's less about just procedure as opposed to maybe the concept or analyzing. And then somewhat directed is kind of just what it sounds like. It's a mix of the two. And so the nice thing about the maps is that they actually, whether you go directed or undirected, kind of go across the spectrum. So, that's just something to keep in mind, that if it's, not everybody embraces the map, and I get that, but if it is something that works with your discipline, it often does work with blueprinting or construction or even healthcare, then it might be a good way to go, and you can use it as opposed to, across the cognitive dimensions that you need to. And then projects and performances, that's where I was saying earlier, that's an example, a time for them to have a chance to show a skill or do something creative. And it's really a good way to double up on learning and assessment, because they're going to have to apply new knowledge a lot of times and a skill to an actual real world activity. And then you determine how well they've done that. And a lot of times it's stuff we already do. Like healthcare does clinicals. I mean, that's a performance, right? So, for AMST, I know y'all have a really varied grouping of certificates and programs, but it could be something like if they're in the CDL, getting their CDL, and they need to demonstrate backing. I mean, that's a performance. And if they're doing the graphic, like the GIS, I think that's part of y'all's, if they're producing something using that, that's good. Technical manuals, that might be a time when you say, I'm never going to have to write something, but maybe they do have to do some technical writing. Or, proper disposal of any type of waste. And that goes, like healthcare, they have to dispose of hazardous waste. You guys, you're going to have byproduct. And so maybe just that's one of the learning objectives, and they need to demonstrate that, and they can do that with a project or performance.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. So when would you do that? Again, it's when you want to cover a topic in depth and make it real world, like bring it home, I think, because they can be challenging. They require some initiative and some problem solving. So it might not be, a day one kind of thing. And again, I know we always want to be clear on grading, but be clear on your expectations. Ensure that you've got that alignment and that you're reflecting an observable goal. You might want a rubric or a checklist for that. I think checklists are great for presentations because it's like you did it or you didn't do it. Whereas a rubric, sometimes it's more like you did it well. So it depends on what they're showing you. And just keep in mind that, you know, if it's a one-off, that's great. Like maybe hand washing or something, you know, they don't need a ton. They're not going to be doing that, you know, the entire semester every week. I mean, they might if they're in clinicals because they're going to have to be doing it. They're going to get dinged if they don't. But if they're doing like some humongo project, you know, you might need to check in with them more. So that's just something to keep in mind too. Again, I like for you guys to take care of yourselves as well. Just thinking about grading and feedback. And one thing that helps them is, you know, they understand that it's sometimes, if possible, that we're grading them about their growth through it versus them just creating something in the end. And so this one, again, is across a number of the dimensions. I mean, it's not quite as varying as the maps because, you know, the maps kind of had one here and one here. But for a single type of thing, it covers a lot because it can go from, you know, just basically understanding something, depending on what the presentation or the project looks like, all the way up to evaluating. And sometimes, you know, they're going to create something new, but it's generally in this area. So, we are a few minutes early, which is fantastic. But just to kind of give you an idea, I know I had mentioned earlier that we all kind of feel like things right now are very in flux, and we're all getting a lot of, we're going to get updates later. But today really was a lot about the theory, and I will email you all the tools that I showed you. And you can call me if you need me, but, you know, you will be getting together within your schools at some point, and at this point I'm not sure if Center for Teaching Excellence is going to be handling that, or if your deans or your department chairs will be, but that'll be an opportunity for you to thought about it and try to maybe implement it, even if it's only one lesson or one assessment that you do during these weird times that we're facing right now. Y'all can kind of review that within your colleges, review it, maybe say, oh, you know, I can update this better for the next time. And then the idea is that, again, there will be a third meeting. And again, I don't know if it's going to be CTE led or college led, but that's when the idea is that you guys get together also and talk about what went well, what didn't. You know, I tried these things, I updated this thing, and it just was terrible. You know, why do we think that was? Was that, you know, it's just, I didn't pick the best way to do it, or was it just a one-off? Did I just have a group that I don't think it worked well with? Because sometimes that happens. I mean, it's not, you know, we all know that those things just happen. Sometimes it just doesn't all come together. So I just kind of wanted to give you a very vague idea of the path, the idea of what's coming ahead with the rest of the faculty enrichment. It's a little unclear still on our end, but I do know that it's meant to be steps, and it's meant to support you through all of these changes with guided pathways. So I hope that, you know, you got some value from today, that if you have any questions, you feel comfortable reaching out to me. I will email you those documents so you don't feel like you have to write this down. I mean, you're more than welcome to, but you'll get an email directly from me, and I will have all those documents in there, obviously my contact information. I won't have any update for you on those next steps, but it will have all of this information, as well as several, like just some reference material. It'll have the chart that you can use to plot if you like. It'll be those kinds of things. The revised blooms is in there. So if when you get that little packet of information from me, you have questions, you're welcome to reach out. But that is all that I have. And if you have questions, I'm happy to stick around since we finished a few minutes early. But if you would like to go off and live your lives, I certainly understand that as well.